Well, welcome to Chapter 17. And in Chapter 17, we're going to be learning something called contract verbs. Contract verbs simply are verbs whose stems end in an alpha, in an epsilon, or an omicron. Now, the nice thing in this chapter is that there's no new paradigms to learn. We are going to be learning some contract rules. What happens when two vowels come up against each other and they contract? They're going to change. But for the most part, it's a straightforward chapter, and I don't think you'll have a whole lot of trouble with it. What are contract verbs? Well, as I said, contract verbs are verbs whose stems end in an alpha, epsilon, or an omicron. And so for alpha contract verbs, I use agapao, which means I love. For epsilon contracts, I use poieo, which means I do or make. And for the omicron contracts, I use pleirao, which means I fill or fulfill. Okay? So we're going to be learning the inflectional patterns for agapao, poieo, and pleirao. And what's going to be really nice is that there's patterns in these. In other words, once you learn how agapao forms is different for second, third person singular forms, that kind of stuff, you know then how all alpha contracts are going to behave. Once you learn all the poieo forms, you're going to know how all epsilon contract verbs are going to behave. So there's some very distinct patterns with contract verbs. So that's really nice. But basically, here's what happens in contraction. If you have the form, let's say, poieo, okay, that's the lexical form. Poieo, the root or the stem is same thing, is poiea. When you add the amen onto it, you have poiea-men. Well, that's what the Greeks don't like. That's that hiatus. And so they have to do something to change it. And so what they do is they contract the vowels. And the epsilon and omicron are going to contract to u. So poieomen goes to poiumen. Okay, so that's what we mean by contract verbs, or what we mean by saying vowels are going to contract. They come up against each other. And in order to pronounce them smoothly, they're going to change. They're going to merge into a diphthong or a long vowel. You'll see the patterns. And there are distinct rules that control what happens when these two vowels come up against each other. And I'm a tad ambivalent at times about these rules, because you can parse these forms without ever knowing the rules. But it's hard sometimes to figure out the lexical forms if you don't know what all the different contract rules are. So most teachers require students to know the rules of contraction. So let me give you a couple of examples. Let's say you came across the form poiumen. Okay, what is it? Well, you will have memorized the lexical form poieo, means I do or make, like I said. And you would look at poiumen and you would go, well, this is from poieo. The men tells me it's a first person plural, so it's a first person plural form of poieo. You may not know why it's u, but you can still parse it, can't you? If you go to pleirute, you will have learned a lexical form pleirao. You look at the pleirute, you may not know why it's omicron upsilon, but the te tells you it's second person plural, right? You see a form like agapas, and you go, well, I memorized agapao. And boy, that's a little harder, isn't it? But you do know that on the second person singular ending, ace, epsilon, iota, sigma, you know that iotas can subscript under long vowels, and so you might be able to figure out that's the second person singular, which of course is what it is. If you saw poio, you may have memorized it as poieo. In other words, the epsilon's gone away, but even if you don't fully understand why, you're going to be able to tell it's a first person singular, right? Agaposi. Well, the C ending tells you it's a third person plural. You may not understand the omega. So that's what I mean by saying I'm a little ambivalent towards these rules, because you generally can parse them without knowing the rules. But they're important to know because the rules help you get to the lexical form. So let's take a look at the rules. There are 8 rules altogether. The first 5 are hands down the most important. I call them the big 5. So let's take a look at them. Rule number 1 has to do with the form omicron upsilon. And rule 1 says that omicron upsilon is formed by the combinations of omicron epsilon, or shift them around, epsilon omicron, or by the combination of omicron omicron. Okay? So this rule has to do with the formation of the diphthong u. So if you have the first person plural form of poieo, it's going to be poieomen. It's going to contract to poiumen, okay? If you have the second person plural form of plerao, it's pleraete, which is going to contract to plerute. And if you have the first person plural form of plerao, you have pleraomen, there's a hard one to say, pleraomen, is going to contract to plerumen. Okay, so those are examples for your first rule of contraction, one of the more important rules. The second rule of contraction has to do with the diphthong epsilon iota. And rule 2 says that epsilon iota is formed out of the combination of epsilon, epsilon. So this handles second person plural forms of epsilon contracts. You would have poiete, which would then contract to poiete. Okay, so those are your first two rules, the most important of the rules probably. Rule number 3 has to do with omega, and I call it the big bully rule. And I call it the big bully rule because omegas just swallow up everything in their path, okay? The rule says that an omega is formed by almost any combination of omicron or omega joining with any other vowel, all right? Except for those in rule 1. So, for example, if you have the first person plural form of agapao, you're going to have agapaomen, and it's going to go to agapomen, okay? This also affects our in lexical forms. If you have the root agapa, okay, you're going to have learned it as agapao. And what's going on in the dictionary forms and what's going on in the lexicons in general is that they're giving you the uncontracted form of these verbs. If they gave you the contracted form, you wouldn't be able to tell if it was an alpha, epsilon, or omicron contract verb, right? If the lexicon just said agapo, you couldn't tell. So what the lexicons do is they give you the uncontracted form. But when that first person singular form actually occurs in the text, the contraction is going to have occurred. And so you'll have agapao in the lexicon, but in the Bible, it will actually say agapo. And if this helps at all, inside my ring, my wife has inscribed to me the words agapo se. I'll let you figure it out, but it's agapo. It's the contracted form of the verb. All right. Contraction rules 4 and 5 are flip sides of each other. And rule 4 says that alpha is formed from the combination alpha epsilon. And then if you switch the order, rule 5 is that eta is formed from the combination epsilon alpha. So in a sense, it's whoever gets there first. Okay, what's the first vowel? If it's an alpha, then it's going to lengthen to a long alpha. If it's an epsilon, it's going to lengthen to a long eta. Okay, so it's alpha, epsilon, epsilon, alpha. It's whatever one's first determines what's going to happen. So for example, in the second person plural form for agapao, you would have agapaete, which would then contract to agapate. Okay? And you don't have any examples so far of eta being formed by epsilon alpha, but they're coming. All right. Okay, those are the big 5 rules. Now, the other 3 rules are more miscellaneous than anything else, but they're important. Rule 6 has to do with the diphthong omicron iota. Rule 6 says that omicron iota is formed from the combination of omicron epsilon iota. And the reason that's so important is it explains the second and third person singular forms of omicron contracts. And of all the forms that you're going to be looking at, these are the most confusing. In fact, if you see these and you don't recognize it's a contract verb, you can get stuck trying to figure out what they are. But so, for example, if you have plerao, so you have the stem plera, and you add the ace ending onto it, plerace goes to plerois. And in the third person singular, you have plera plus epsilon iota is going to go to pleroi. Okay? So rule 6 has to do with those 2 specific forms. And like I say, they're tricky, so you need to make sure you understand them. I'm going to skip rule 7 for a second. I'll come back to it. But rule 8 is kind of an obvious thing, and you may have already seen it at work. Rule 8 simply says that if you're trying to figure out what the contractions are going to be, they're contracting not with the true personal endings, but with the altered personal endings. In other words, if you take the stem of the word and you're trying to follow the rules through, use o, ace, a, amen, eta, usi. Okay, don't use the true endings. Use those modified forms. And that's what Rule 8 is saying. And again, it's only for people who are really trying to carefully see, how did I get to this contracted diphthong or this long vowel? Okay, so that's Rule 8. Rule 7 has to do with diphthongs. And the situation is where you have a single vowel and then you have a diphthong. And what's going to happen? And one of the rules is that contractions work from left to right in a word, not right to left. In other words, the first thing that's going to happen is that the single vowel and the first vowel, the diphthong, are going to look at each other and do something. And then after that's done, then the final vowel, the diphthong, does something. Okay, so contractions are left to right. And here's the basic rules for diphthongs. It all has to do whether the single vowel and the first vowel, the diphthong, are the same or they're different. Okay, that's what decides everything. So rule number 7 says that when you have a single vowel followed by a diphthong, if the single vowel and the first vowel, the diphthong, are the same, they simplify. In other words, that means this one just drops out. Okay, so if you have the second person plural form with poieo, you have poies. You have 2 epsilons or the same vowel, and so one of them just drops out, and you end up with poies. Again, you have the neat little accent over the iota, so you can tell that there's been something going on. If, however, that single vowel is different from the first vowel of the diphthong, then those 2 vowels contract according to the rules that we've already looked at, okay? Well, what's going to happen then to the final vowel of the diphthong? Well, if it's an upsilon, it goes away. If it's an iota, it subscripts. Okay, so that's how the rule works out. So in the third person singular form with agapao, you have agapa alpha plus epsilon iota. The alpha and the epsilon are different, and so they're going to contract. Alpha comes before epsilon, so it's rule 4, so it goes to a long alpha. The second vowel of the diphthong is an iota, so it subscripts. Okay, so that's rule 7 on diphthongs. It all depends upon whether the single vowel and the first vowel of the diphthong are the same or different. Okay, but it's pretty straightforward, I think. Let's take a look at the actual chart then for alpha, epsilon, and omicron contract verbs. Here it is. The most important thing you can do here simply is to spend some time looking at them. And you need to ask yourself 2 questions. Number 1 is, would I be able to parse if I saw it? If I saw agaposi, would I know it's a third person plural? Yeah, again, the omega may throw you for a bit, but you could tell it's a third person plural. So look at these forms and make sure that they would be obvious to you when you're parsing. But the other thing you need to do is just spend some time and follow the contractions through. And just make sure that you understand how the contract rules actually get put into place with forms, okay? Technically speaking, on poies and poie, second and third person singular, they're not quite following the contract rules I've given you. There should be in iota subscript in both cases if you wanted to be technical about it. But poies and poie are so obviously second and third person singular, people don't have problems with it, so I just decided to gloss over it. One of the other things you should see in this paradigm, though, is the wonderful hint of the circumflex. Okay, that circumflex is always over the contracted vowel or diphthong. Okay, that's one of the clues that you're dealing with a contract verb. And as I said before, playrois and playroi, second and third person singular, those are the tricky ones. They're not going to occur a whole lot, but they are tricky in terms of being able to parse them. So make sure that you pay close attention to them. And by the way, here's a good reminder for remembering the rules for the connecting vowel. Look at this first person plural form, poiumen. Well, what's the vowel before the mu? Well, it has to be an omicron, right? All right. So what vowel is contracting with it to form an u? Or in other words, could poi be an alpha contract verb? Well, no. If it were poiao, the alpha and omicron would have contracted to an omega. Okay, so it can't be an alpha contract. Could it be an epsilon contract? Yes. Could it be an omicron contract? Yes. So in that particular case, knowing the rules for the connecting vowel and the rules for contraction will at least remove the possibility of poi being an alpha contract. But that's some of the kind of detective work that you have to do, is looking at what the connecting vowel would be based on the next letter of the personal ending. And then that will help you go backwards to figure out what the lexical form of the word actually is. So what did we learn in this chapter? Well, we learned contract verbs, right? Contract verbs are verbs whose stems end in alpha, epsilon, or omicron. We learned 8 contract rules, the first 5 being the most important. Okay, rule 1 is omicron upsilon is formed by the combination of omicron epsilon, epsilon omicron, or omicron omicron. Rule 2 has to do with epsilon iota, and epsilon iota is formed from epsilon epsilon. Rule 3 is the bully rule, that omega is formed with any combination of omicron or omega with any other vowel, except for those covered by rule number 1. Rules 4 and 5 are flip sides of the same rule, and it's whatever vowel comes first wins. So alpha is formed from alpha epsilon, the alpha lengthening to a long alpha. And eta is formed from the combination of epsilon alpha, the epsilon lengthening to a long eta. And then we got to the 3 kind of miscellaneous rules. Rule 6 is omicron iota is formed from omicron epsilon iota, and you get play-royce and play-roy. Rule number 8 was that we're dealing with the full personal endings, o, ase, amen, eta, usi. And rule 7 is the rule for diphthongs, and it all has to do with the single vowel and the first vowel of the diphthong. If they're the same, they're going to simplify and one's going to drop out. But if the single vowel and the first vowel of the diphthong are different, then they will contract according to the normal rules. And then the second vowel of the diphthong, if it's an upsilon, it goes away, and if it's an iota, it will subscript. So that's it for chapter 17. But let me say something before you get into the vocabulary. If you look at all the words you're going to be learning in BBG, those that occur 50 times or more, what you're going to find is that there's only one omicron contract vowel. It's verb. It's playrao. You're going to see that there's only 4 alpha contract verbs, like agapao, but there's a lot of epsilon contract verbs, okay? So you need to learn all the patterns, but you need to be especially sure that you know epsilon contracts, because that's what you're going to see most of the time, okay? All right. Well, let's take a look at the vocabulary for chapter 17. Agapao. I love, cherish. Daimonion, daimoniu, ta. Demon. Zeteo. I seek, desire, try to obtain. Kaleo. I call, name, invite. Laleo. I speak, say. Oida. I know, understand. Hatan. Whenever. Playon, play on. Larger, more. Playrao. I fill, complete, fulfill. Poieo. I do, make. Tereo. I keep, guard, observe.